Welcome to part 3 of Phoenix Ashes Going Insane. The debate is not happening. I received no response whatsoever from Mr. Kevin Pendragon. This is a shame since I really wanted that debate, though I knew full well that he wouldn't accept that invitation, and that's why I wasn't afraid of staking the odds against myself so much. Why was I sure that this debate wouldn't happen? One reason that I think might be at play is that he realized that I realized something about one of his videos. And the more solid reason is that he knew that it wouldn't be easy to hide from me that Daenerys was sold into slavery. A fact that he omitted from his video and by extension from his very impressionable audience. I mean, we already established that A Song of Ice and Fire fandom believes in made-up quotes, so... The three of us, Kevin, Hillary and I, make some bold claims in our videos, but it seems like only one of us is willing to answer to them and stand by them. The other two clearly avoid confrontation. The boldest Kay can do is pin my comments, thinking he's owning me, but he instead shows what he is. Someone who, after attacking someone, hides his head in the sand. That says a lot about him. But anyway, I pray to God that this is going to be the last part of the video and I can finally stop listening to him. Are you guys ready for the rest of the sub-poor PowerPoint presentation? That would have been half as long if Kevin stopped repeating the same statement 3 times.
Let's take a brief trip to the United States during the time of slavery. Daenerys defenders enjoy the topic of slavery very much. Their favorite pastime is calling anyone that upsets them pro-slavery. So I figure a little lesson on the peculiar institution would be appropriate here. During this time, women did not have many rights. I'm talking, of course, of white women. Black women were slaves and had 0 rights because they were slaves. The wealthy white women were treated to arranged marriages that sometimes they were unable to oppose. The age of consent was also quite low, and so you might have a very young white woman with few rights of her own living on a plantation with a man she may or may not have wanted to marry, surrounded by slaves. Marital was not a crime, so she could be violated by her own husband and he would face no punishment. Does this mean that she, the mistress of the plantation, was powerless? No, the wife of a slave owner wielded a terrible power of her own. Their victims were typically the slaves. There are horror stories of what these mistresses did to the slaves. White women of the time were disenfranchised, but they were still capable of owning slaves themselves. Some wives of slave owners did take pity on the slaves. They shared some level of victimhood as they were all powerless under the hand of the slave master who owned all the property. Does that mean the mistress of the plantation was on equal footing with the slaves because she was sold off to be married to some slave master? No, that would be utterly absurd. Yet Phoenix Ashes seems to be completely disregarding that Dany was in a similar position as those mistresses, the wives of the slave owners. They are disregarding that Daenerys did own slaves. They make excuses for why Daenerys had to keep these women as slaves, because Daenerys, she could have advocated for these women to be allowed to go free, but she did not. Her alternative was a gentler form of bondage. What Phoenix Ashes is doing is apologizing for why Daenerys had to keep slaves. This is a pro-slavery stance. Slavery, I suppose, is acceptable so long as Daenerys Targaryen is the one doing it. Again, Daenerys could have said, "Drogo, free these women. I would like for you to free these women," but she did not. I believe the misunderstanding that Daenerys was also herself a slave comes from a moment in A Storm of Swords where she and Arstan Whitebeard have a heated moment. Arstan begs Dany not to linger in Slaver's Bay and by the Unsullied. If she arrives in Westeros at the head of a slave army, she would be rejected by the realm. Quote, "Better to come a beggar than a slaver," Arstan said. There speaks one who has been neither. Dany's nostrils flared. "Do you know what it is to be sold, squire?" "I do. My brother sold me to Khal Drogo for the promise of a golden crown. Well, Drogo crowned him in gold, though not as he had wished, and My sun and stars made a queen of me, but if he had been a different man, it might have been much otherwise. Do you think I have forgotten how it felt to be afraid?" End quote. Daenerys says Viserys sold her, but not as a slave, and she says Drogo made a queen of her.
Congratulations to Kevin for finally finding a quote where Daenerys acknowledges her relationship to Drogo as being a matter of being sold, which he then immediately disregards as a metaphor. But no, this isn't the only exchange that points to that. There are many others that Kevin never once acknowledged. Do I have to repeat myself? Do I really have to do that? Okay, you know what? Here we shall compile all the characters and all the moments where it's told to us outright that the relationship between Khal Drogo and Daenerys was that of bridal slavery. I don't feel like reading this out loud once more. I'm putting this into a text-to-speech because I'm tired of repeating myself.
There came a soft knock on her door. "Come," Dany said, turning away from the window. Illyrio's servants entered, bowed, and set about their business. They were slaves, a gift from one of the Magister's many Dothraki friends. There was no slavery in the free city of Pentos. Nonetheless, they were slaves. Ser Jorah grunted. "Yes, Khaleesi, but the Dothraki look on these things differently than we do in the West. I have told him as much, as Illyrio told him, but your brother does not listen. The horse lords are no traitors. Viserys thinks he sold you, and now he wants his price. Yet Khal Drogo would say he had you as a gift. He will give Viserys a gift in return, yes, in his own time." It was a truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Illyrio could afford to be lavish. He had collected a fortune in horses and slaves for his part in selling her to Khal Drogo. Drogo is so rich that even his slaves wear golden collars. 100,000 men ride in his Khalasar, and his palace in Bees Dothrak has 200 rooms and doors of solid silver. The girl slid the gilded sandals onto her feet, while the old woman fixed the tiara in her hair, and slid golden bracelets crusted with amethysts around her wrists. Last of all came the collar, a heavy golden tor emblazoned with ancient Valyrian glyphs. "Now you look all a princess," the girl said breathlessly when they were done. Dany glanced at her image in the silvered-looking glass that Illyrio had so thoughtfully provided. A princess, she thought, but she remembered what the girl had said, how Khal Drogo was so rich even his slaves wore golden collars. She felt a sudden chill, and gooseflesh pimpled her bare arms. The palanquin slowed and stopped. The curtains were thrown back, and a slave offered a hand to help Daenerys out. His collar, she noted, was ordinary bronze.
And would you look at that? 13-year-old Daenerys recognizes what a grown Kevin fails to do. Yes, she is a glorified slave. Even within slavery, there exists a hierarchy. Daenerys stands above, say, latrine scrubbers, sex slaves in the brothels or the Lazarine women, but that does not mean she is no longer a slave. In every slave society, there existed hierarchies. We keep returning to the Ottoman harems. Roxolana was born in today's Ukraine, and during the Tatar raids, she was kidnapped and sold into slavery, probably in Crimea, and she was then shipped off to Istanbul. She was selected as a gift for the Sultan's son, Mohammed. A gift! Does it ring a bell? She was even renamed from Roxolana to Hürrem. So, if there were other slaves of lower stands in the imperial harem, I don't know, kitchen drafts or whatever, and she was able to give them orders, does that give her genuine power? Is she their owner? No! Because she was a slave! She was somewhat privileged ahead of them, since as the Sultan's concubine, she was well cared for, but she was still a sex slave. She did eventually become the Sultan's rightful wife and his actual consort who wielded actual power, which is why she is considered such an unprecedented figure, since she was the very first woman to ever receive the title of Haseki Sultan. This was the first time ever when a slave became the Sultan's rightful wife, setting a precedent for the future, and Haseki Sultan actually held power at court. Roxolana is actually considered to be like one of the most powerful women that have ever lived, basically. The difference between Daenerys and Roxolana is that Dany never reached a point where she was granted any power in her own right. All of that was Drogo's whims and nothing more. Kevin believes in earnest that Daenerys had the power to just free the slaves, but luckily one of my viewers pointed out that even George believes that Dany can't enact this very idea.
And Dany here is appalled by the rape and slaughter that she's seeing. Khal Drogo is moving. He has taken his Khalasar toward the sea to begin the conquest of Westeros, but it's quite a way to the sea, and of course they have to be fed, and when they reach the sea, they're going to need a way to get these ships to take them across. So slaving is one of the ways that the Dothraki earn money, although they don't look at it earn, they look at it as an exchange of gifts. The Dothraki do not actually believe in buying and selling in the same way as the more mercantile civilizations of the West. So Dany can't enact the idea of don't take slaves. So Dany can't enact the idea of don't take slaves.
So, no, she can't just tell them to not do it, proving that she does not have that power. And once more, she was already pushing boundaries and fearing that maybe she went too far.
When she was done, Drogo was frowning. This is the way of war. These women are our slaves now, to do with as we please. It pleases me to hold them safe, Dany said, wondering if she had dared too much.
So if she worries about going too far here, how would Drogo react if she said, nah, we're freeing them? Even Dany claiming them for herself was a move that caused the Khalasar to be hostile to her. I mean, why do you guys think that Mago took revenge by gang-raping Iroha specifically? Because he saw Daenerys claim her and he said, take that you silver-haired bitch. Since Kevin likes the non-canon show so much, let's look at how other Khaleesi's outside of Daenerys recant the absolutely great power they had alongside their Khals.
Jinak, Lazari, Khalirge, Versa, Vaisish. Trisererek.
Akathi.
Makishan Mayaha. Kifi Kash Shatlaya Famai.
Mesembe Serge.
I bet this 12-year-old girl who gave birth at 13 was the third most powerful person in her Khalasar. Okay, and with tangents, let's continue to gather our quotes.
Best we get Princess Daenerys wedded quickly before they hand half the wealth of Pentos away to sellswords and bravos, Ser Jorah Mormont jested. The exile had offered her brother his sword the night Dany had been sold to Khal Drogo. Viserys had accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their constant companion ever since. I want what I came for, he told her. I want the crown he promised me. He bought you, but he never paid for you. Tell him I want what I bargained for, or I'm taking you back. You and the eggs both. He can keep his bloody full. I'll cut the bastard out and leave it for him. My brother and I were guests in Illyrio's manse for half a year. If he meant to sell us, he could have done it then. He did sell you, Ser Jorah said. To Khal Drogo. Dany flushed. He had the truth of it, but she did not like the sharpness with which he put it. Illyrio protected us from the usurper's knives, and he believed in my brother's cause. Better to come a beggar than a slaver, Arstan said. There speaks one who has been neither. Dany's nostrils flared. Do you know what it is like to be sold, squire? I do. My brother sold me to Khal Drogo for the promise of a golden crown. Well, Drogo crowned him in gold, though not as he had wished, and my son and stars made a queen of me, but if he had been a different man, it might have been much otherwise. Do you think I have forgotten how it felt to be afraid?
I know why Kevin used this particular quote, because here Daenerys speaks positively about her relationship to Drogo, which is undoubtedly Stockholm Syndrome. All of a sudden, the unreliable narrator excuse does not apply and Dany is 100% reliable in this specific case. Funny how this works.
If truth be told, I did not think Daenerys would survive for long amongst the horse lords. That did not stop you selling her to Khal Drogo. Dothraki neither buy nor sell. Say rather that her brother Viserys gave her to Drogo to win the Khals' friendship.
Remember, Dothraki are slavers, even if they do not have a concept of money, as already explained by Jorah.
I know that she spent her childhood in exile, impoverished, living on dreams and schemes, running from one city to the next, always fearful, never safe, friendless, but for a brother who was by all accounts half-mad, a brother who sold her maidenhood to the Dothraki for the promise of an army. Daenerys, my delight, beneath that sweet young breast beats a tender heart. But take counsel from an older, wiser head. Things are not always as they seem. Much that may seem evil can be good. Consider rain. Rain? Does he take me for a fool, or just a child? We curse the rain when it falls upon our heads, yet without it we should starve. The world needs rain, and slaves. You make a face, but it is true. Consider Qarth. In art, music, magic, trade, all that makes us more than beasts, Qarth sits above the rest of mankind as you sit at the summit of this pyramid, but below, in place of bricks, the magnificence that is the queen of cities rests upon the backs of slaves. Ask yourself, if all men must grub in the dirt for food, how shall any man lift his eyes to contemplate the stars? If each of us must break his back to build a hovel, who shall raise the temples to glorify the gods? For some men to be great, others must be enslaved. He was too eloquent for her. Dany had no answer for him, only the raw feeling in her belly. Slavery is not the same as rain, she insisted. I have been rained on and I have been sold. It is not the same. No man wants to be owned.
Hello, a Dance with Dragons, and she still considers herself to have been owned.
You hurt me. You frightened me. Only when you woke the dragon. I loved you. You sold me. You betrayed me. No. You were the betrayer. You turned against me, against your own blood. They cheated me. Your horsey husband and his stinking savages. They were cheats and liars. They promised me a golden crown and gave me this. He touched the molten gold that was creeping down his face, and smoke rose from his finger. You could have had your crown, Dany told him. My sun and stars would have won it for you if only you had waited. I waited long enough. I waited my whole life. I was their king, their rightful king. They laughed at me. You should have stayed in Pentos with Magister Illyrio. Khal Drogo had to present me to the Dosh Khaleen, but you did not have to ride with us. That was your choice. Your mistake. Do you want to wake the dragon, you stupid little whore? Drogo's khalasar was mine. I bought them from him 100,000 screamers. I paid for them with your maidenhead.
Let's also look what George has to say about it.
George, definitely. I have a large cast of viewpoint characters, but, for most part, they all have something that makes them a bit of an outcast. Tyrion is a dwarf, Jon Snow is a bastard, Dany, who's beautiful, is a penniless exile who's being essentially sold off in marriage. Shaw, you created Jon as a bastard and an outcast from the get-go. Yet he's also one of the most attractive characters. Did you choose to make Jon a bastard to make him more attractive as an underdog, or was his bastard birth central to the shaping of his character itself? Martin, almost all the characters have problems in some way. Very few of my major viewpoint characters have all the answers or have an easy path through life. They all have burdens to bear. Some of them are women in a society that doesn't necessarily value women or give them a lot of power or independence. Tyrion, of course, is a dwarf which has its own challenges. Dany is an exile, powerless, penniless, at the mercy of other people, and Jon is a bastard. These things shape their characters. Your experiences in life, your place in life inevitably is going to change who you are.
Does it really not ring a bell? Is it really that difficult to realize? I'm just so exhausted at this point. And you know what? I can't even entirely blame him for this. Only Dany extremists notice that. Everyone else assumes that it's yet another shitty arranged marriage. Speaking of which,
Tywin Lannister sold off his daughter Cersei and made a queen of her. But a better example perhaps would be Daenerys Targaryen was married to Khal Drogo for an army, much in the same way Lysa Tully was married to Jon Arryn for an army. In all three cases, Dany, Lysa, and Cersei, the circumstances were awful. These women were at the whim of the men that had more power over them. But when it comes to the queen, the Khaleesi, or even the wife of the hand of the king, they had privileges and protections the subjects and slaves beneath them absolutely do not have.
one of the things that differentiates Cersei from Dany is that Westeros is not a culture where slavery per se exists. As such, Cersei cannot be sold in the same way as Dany was sold in Essos, in a place where slavery is the economic base of the continent, by someone whose culture practices slavery, to someone whose culture practices slavery. Do I really have to explain it? Do I have to pull out the same quotes we've seen? Kevin accused me of omitting the quotes where the Lazarine women are called slaves, which nobody ever denied, by the way, but he himself omitted the many and numerous lines where it's highlighted that what happened to Dany was a purchase, in a literal sense, not a metaphorical selling, as in the case of Cersei and Lysa. The key difference between Cersei and Lysa and Daenerys is also what I highlighted when I compared Dany to Alicent. That Cersei and Lysa were born to paramount houses, were rich, well cared for and educated, whereas Daenerys and Viserys were literal beggars on the streets before Illyrio took them in. Cersei or Lysa are never once referred to as having been sold in a literal sense, and the position they possessed granted them far more power than whatever Daenerys had under Drogo. For one, Cersei and Lysa were never endangered with the prospect of their husbands one day deciding to just let their friends gang rape them. Cersei and Lysa never lost the power they accessed via their husband after they died. Quite the opposite, since Lysa became de facto Lady of the Vale and Cersei became Joffrey's regent. What happened to Dany after Drogo died? You have 3 seconds to answer. And what would happen if Drogo died before Dany had a chance to ask for Mirri's help? You have 3 seconds to answer. I already showed the quotes. Kevin is drawing a false equivalence, probably not the first one. But if you want to go there, then yes, Uno reverse card. In my eyes, feudal marriage that Lysa and Cersei were subjected to is also a form of enslavement. You know what? I go a step further and I consider even modern marriage to be a form of enslavement. But this is the kind of radicalism that won't slide in this fandom, since it's full of people cooing over the virtues of traditional femininity, duty and sacrifice. This discussion as to whether Dany could in earnest be called a slave owner is not a discussion anyone is having in earnest. For one, no, she can't. The author tells you that she was sold on the 2nd page of her very first chapter. And no, the author only uses the word selling in her context. Secondly, it's only there to cast Dany in the worst possible light, as is the case in most of the arguments against her, to show her as a callous tyrant, as Hills Alive does, or as a hypocrite and a callous tyrant, as Kevin does. This reading is not supported by the text or by the author himself. 40%. This is a 14-year-old, by the way. Not that Kevin cares. He thinks that she can consent to sex, genuinely loves her 28-year-old husband, and he genuinely loves her back. And that she, a 14-year-old, loves him is a sign of her being evil and not a sign of trauma. Remember what he is saying.
Now, as for this scene with Arstan, the irony here is that Dany does not realize she's actually talking to Sir Barristan Selmy, former Lord Commander of the King's Guard, and he was almost bought off by the Lannisters. They tried to buy him with land, attendance, and an income to force his retirement. They put a price on him as a person. Do you see what I'm getting at here? So when Dany questions him, wondering, do you know what it's like to be sold? Yes, he does. Daenerys, in that moment, is just being incredibly ignorant.
On tego kurwa nie powiedział. To nie, to... Nie wierzę. Czy wy to kurwa słyszycie, widzowie? Ten typ prędzej był w stanie uwierzyć, że... Kurwa nie. On uważa, że Barristan został sprzedany, ale że Dany nie była. Coś niesamowitego, ja nie wierzę, co... To jest niesamowite. Brak mi kurwa słów, no to... Nie wierzę w to.
Barristan also knows what it's like to be a beggar, having spent time in Flea Bottom, hiding from Lannister soldiers in gold cloaks before taking ship to Pentos. He says he had little silver during this time, so he slept in seps and alleyways. He wore rough spun clothes, and he had mud on his face. He took his meals in pot shops. Daenerys thinks Arstan has no idea what she's been through, but he can relate in some aspects. She makes these ignorant statements, which is very typical of her character. But we'll move on now.
So Dany is hypocritical and ignorant for saying that neither Barristan nor Jorah know what it's like to be beggars and being sold. Because Barristan was living as a common man for like a month. Mind you, Daenerys lived as a homeless, penniless exile for 13 years. So notice how Kevin says here that this is typical of Daenerys' character, as in her saying ignorant things apparently, but decides to move on rather to give an example, even though there should be plenty. So, this is a lie by omission.
Daenerys was not given over to Drogo as a high-priced concubine or sex slave. She was meant to be his wife, a Khaleesi, a role of honor.
Is there maybe a word for that?
Let's return to Dany's wedding when she received a gift from Drogo, a beautiful silver horse. Quote, "She's beautiful," Dany murmured. "She is the pride of the Khalasar," Illyrio said. Custom decrees that the Khaleesi must ride a mount worthy of her place by the side of the Khal. End quote. A person receiving expensive gifts does not mean they are not a slave, to be sure, but in this case, as Illyrio said, the role of Khaleesi has a level of worth, a worthy place by the side of the Khal.
This does not in any way cancel each other out. Actually, Kevin just contradicted himself. Dany can receive gifts and have a place of honor, but still be a glorified sex slave. You just admitted it! Do you want to return to her wedding day? Sure. We'll do precisely that. Let's reread Daenerys to A Game of Thrones.
Best we get Princess Daenerys wedded quickly before they hand half the wealth of Pentos away to sellswords and bravos, Ser Jorah Mormont jested. The exile had offered her brother his sword the night Dany had been sold to Khal Drogo. Viserys had accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their constant companion ever since. Magister Illyrio laughed lightly through his forked beard, but Viserys did not so much as smile. "He can have her tomorrow, if he likes," her brother said. He glanced over at Dany, and she lowered her eyes. "So long as he pays the price." "Dragon's eggs, from the Shadowlands beyond Ass High," said Magister Illyrio. "The Aeons have turned them to stone, yet still they burn bright with beauty. I shall treasure them always." Dany had heard tales of such eggs, but she had never seen one, nor thought to see one. It was a truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Illyrio could afford to be lavish. He had collected a fortune in horses and slaves for his part in selling her to Khal Drogo.
You just provided a quote from that very chapter. You just read it. It was just before that.
We see this in Essos as we do in Westeros. Where a person is positioned in relation to the leader, be it the Khal or king, is important. When your place is right beside the Khal, what does that tell you? To ignore that is to completely disregard the text in order to frame Daenerys as a powerless victim, incapable of harming anyone else. Unless, of course, the intent is to make Dany to be a helpless victim that can't harm anyone else. To make it so that Dany never owned slaves, even though the text tells us that she did. I must needs repeat myself. That would be defending Daenerys for participating in slavery.
The fear came back to her then, with her brother's words. She felt like a child once more, only 13 and all alone, not ready for what was about to happen to her.
Daenerys' stance on slavery has changed since the first book, but we cannot disregard that Dany once owned slaves. And you would think after this, Daenerys would never participate in slavery in such a way ever again. Until she gets to Meereen, where she allows people to sell themselves into slavery, and she takes 1/10 of the profit of that. How can you end slavery by allowing slavery? And this was not a cold, calculating, and cunning move. This was not Daenerys playing 4D Scythe by saying, I'm going to ruin the economy the slavers have by allowing people to sell themselves into slavery. No. That's not what Dany did. Dany, in the heat of the moment, made a rash decision because she wanted to make slavery into a form that's more acceptable to her. Just like here in the Lazarine village, her handmaiden Doria was bought from a brothel. Quote, Doria, stay and eat with me, Dany commanded when she sent her other handmaids away. The Lysine girl had hair the color of honey and eyes like the summer sea. She lowered those eyes when they were alone. You honor me, Khaleesi, she said, but it was no honor, only service. End quote.
Her brother Viserys gifted her with 3 handmaids. Dany knew they had cost him nothing. Illyrio no doubt had provided the girls. Irri and Jiki were copper-skinned Dothraki with black hair and almond-shaped eyes, Doria a fair-haired, blue-eyed Lysine girl. These are no common servants, sweet sister, her brother told her as they were brought forward one by one. Illyrio and I selected them personally for you. Irri will teach you writing, Jiki the Dothraki tongue, and Doria will instruct you in the womanly arts of love. He smiled thinly. She's very good, Illyrio and I can both swear to that.
Daenerys has other handmaidens, Irri and Jiki. It is known. They were slaves taken by Drogo after he destroyed the Khalasar they once belonged to. And it is hinted that even by the 5th book, Jiki has not fully grasped the difference between servant and slave. Quote, help me dress. I'll have a cup of wine as well to clear my head. To drown my dreams. She could hear the soft sounds of sobs. Who's that weeping? Your slave Missandei. Jiki had a taper in her hand. My servant, I have no slaves. Dany did not understand. Why does she weep? End quote. If Jiki thinks Missandei is a slave when Daenerys has made a great show of freeing the slaves, then what does she think of herself? Daenerys considers Jiki to be free, but what if Jiki does not?
You will be my Khalasar, she told them. I see the faces of slaves. I free you. Take off your collars. Go. If you wish, no one shall harm you. If you stay, it will be as brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. To each of you I say, give me your hands and your hearts, and there will always be a place for you. And after them came her handmaids. And then the others, all the Dothraki, men and women and children, and Dany had only to look at their eyes to know that they were hers now, today and tomorrow and forever, hers as they had never been Drogo's.
Alright, I already hear what Kevin is about to say. Or rather, not say, since he is very insistent on pretending that I no longer exist. But Daenerys is an unreliable narrator, we don't know what it looks like from Jikui's point of view. Let me use my favorite rhetorical device, which is Occam's razor. Essentially it means that the simpler the answer, the more likely it is. What is more likely? 1. That this singular throwaway line said by a minor character indicates that all of Dany's struggle is secretly fake and we were misled because she's basically psychotic and all of the things she perceives are made up. 2. That Jikui says this for some more mundane reason. Let's talk about how little characterization George gave to Jikui and Irri, and to the rest of the Dothraki for that matter. Drogo, Aggo and Rakaro do not have any definitive personality traits, and we tell them apart by the weapons they use. Jikui and Irri have identical personalities, or lack thereof, and the only thing that differentiates them is that one has bigger boobs. The show managed to drop Jikui altogether after one scene, but even they managed to give Irri some characterization. George failed after 5 books. Jikui and Irri have been with Dany since day one. They crossed the Dothraki Sea with her, they witnessed her birth the dragons, they crossed the Red Ways together, they witnessed her campaign in Astapor, Yunkai, and now in Mirri. And somehow, that did not affect their outlook on life at all. They are the same characters they've been in Book 1. Compare this to other side characters of our viewpoints. Jon, for example, has the Brothers of the Night's Watch, each with a distinct personality and backstory and a way to differentiate them outside of their body shape or the weapon they use. Funnily enough, I often see this state of things used against Daenerys, the fictional character, and not against the real-life human being author George R.R. Martin. Jon and Daenerys have somewhat parallel journeys, right? Both of them are forced into cultures they at first fear and don't understand, but later grow to appreciate and even love. Now let's compare the Dothraki and the Wildlings. All the Dothraki essentially have the same personalities. All Khalasars practice identical culture, with no variety whatsoever. The Free Folk, however, consist of clans and other loose formations that differ in their cultural practices. Even very minor characters are distinct from one another, like Rattleshart or Harma. How are Aggo and Rakaro distinct from one another? So, is this Dany's fault that George failed to give her people any characterization and depth whatsoever, or is this the fault of the author? Going back to Jikui and her outlook on life, the simpler way to explain this is that Dothraki have no concept of servitude, only slavery. To her, servant and slave are essentially synonyms, because the culture she grew up with only ever has the concept of slavery. And this proves what I said before, that Jikui was written so poorly that after witnessing what Dany did, she still does not see a difference between the two, that her outlook on life has not changed. But of course, Kevin may still insist that, yes, this line proves Dany's unreliability, that she still owns slaves, which contradicts earlier point, that Dany's stance on slavery changed, again. And that is because of her unreliability, that she only thinks she's doing something good, that this is some grand trickery only the smartest cookies realized. But this is also contradicted by other POVs. Tyrion, an extremely cynical and rather reliable POV, who has never met Dany and has no reason to lie about her, encounters various freedmen who consider her basically a messianic figure. Barristan also never makes allusions to how Dany is hypocritical or secretly evil, even if we see him sometimes criticize her, both in his and her POV. So again, are we cutting this argument with Occam's razor? I think we reasonably can.
As for Mirri Maz Dor, Drogo quite literally tells Daenerys that Mirri is now a slave. Quote, "My time is near," Dany said. "I would have you attend me when he comes, if you would." Khal Drogo laughed. "Moon of my life, you do not ask a slave, you tell her. She will do as you command." He jumped down from the altar. "Come, my blood, the stallions call. This place is ashes. It's time to ride." End quote. Drogo laughs because he doesn't understand Dany is offering Mirri a courtesy, a kindness Mirri will not return. Mirri, no doubt, shares a similar mindset to Drogo. Daenerys can ask kindly, but little does that matter. Dany's request, kind as they are, will still be interpreted as commands to a slave.
Challenge for you all. Find a passage of me ever denying that Mirri was a slave. Whoever managed to do this will receive $5 from me. And since Kevin brought up this passage, I think this proves something else than what he asserts. Daenerys not only wants to treat Mirri with respect and kindness, but also that while Mirri is undoubtedly a slave, Dany does not necessarily treat her as a slave. The way Dany formulates this request is, well, a request, not an order, and only Drogo says, "Girl, you can just order her around as you please." This shows that, even as someone who supposedly has so much power and had it for something like a year or so, she is still insecure in it and, most crucially, gives her subject some degree of free will. That Dany requests this proves that Mirri, as Drogo's slave but a subject of Dany, from Dany's perspective, is in a position to refuse orders. And that is a pretty big deal. By the way, I feel the need to bring up this particular scene from the show, which necessarily had to color Kevin's understanding of Dany's dynamic with Drogo, since it's very clear that it colors it to a substantial degree. Since he uses show stills to argue points from the books. Either he mixes the two or he projects Dany's show counterpart on her book counterpart, which is vastly different even in season 1. Remember, it's a different medium and only the books are canon.
Men want what they've never had. And the Dothraki take slaves like a hound takes a bitch. Are you a slave, Khaleesi?
This scene can be interpreted in two ways. One, that Dany was not sold and was never a slave, or two, Dany was a slave, as shown by the fact that she was taken as a slave from behind, and that the moment she asserts herself sexually in that relationship, this is the end of her slavery and the beginning of her freedom. Whichever interpretation is, I guess, fine in the context of the show alone. This scene, however, never happens in the books. All we know about this conversation in the books is one sentence.
One might argue, as Phoenix Ashes does in their video, that it is necessary for Daenerys to claim these women in order to protect them. Daenerys will see that they come to no harm. There are two reasons why this is a terrible line of thinking. For one, these women are likely going to Slaver's Bay. Quote, "Most of Ogo's riders fled," Ser Jorah was saying. "Still, there may be as many as 10,000 captives. Slaves," Dany thought. Khal Drogo would drive them downriver to one of the towns on Slaver's Bay. She wanted to cry, but she told herself that she must be strong. This is war. This is what it looks like. This is the price for the Iron Throne. "I've told the Khal to make for Meereen," Ser Jorah said. "They'll pay a better price than he'd get from a slaving caravan." Illyrio writes that they had a plague last year, so the brothels are paying double for healthy young girls and triple for boys under 10. If enough children survive the journey, the gold will buy us all the ships we need and hire men to sail them. End quote. And look, shut up, I know what happens next. I know what she does next. She stops all the... That's like one of the major points of the video, so if you made it this far, don't comment, but she does, I know. What she does is make war prettier for her, more palatable for her, because these women, they're still going to be slaves, in the Khalasar or somewhere else. Because you know what, Dany never suggests to free them.
So Dany can't enact the idea of don't take slaves. So Dany can enact the idea of don't take slaves.
Daenerys can claim them, but she cannot keep them forever. Remember, Drogo is raiding in order to raise the funds needed to sail to Westeros. To do that, he needs to sell people into slavery. Daenerys is only protecting them on the road to Slaver's Bay or some other dark fate. Dany also suggested that if Drogo's men want these women, then they should take them gently as wives. So get this, Daenerys isn't opposed to giving away the women for marriage to Dothraki riders, which is exactly what happened to her. Can't domestic abuse still happen? Isn't marital still a possibility? Dany makes rash decisions with no planning, no idea of what the future looks like.
Daenerys forces rape victims to marry their rapists.
These accusations come from when Dany witnesses the Lazaran woman being raped and tries to negotiate a way to stop this. He says the Khaleesi has taken his spoils, a daughter of the lambs who was his to mount. Khal Drogo's face was still and hard, but his black eyes were curious as they went to Dany. "Tell me the truth of this, moon of my life," he commanded in Dothraki. Dany told him what she had done, in his own tongue, so the Khal would understand her better, her words simple and direct. When she was done, Drogo was frowning. "This is the way of war. These women are our slaves now, to do as we please. It pleases me to hold them safe," Dany said, wondering if she had dared too much. "If your warriors would mourn these women, let them take them gently and keep them for wives. Give them places in the Khalasar and let them bear you sons." Dany is 14, pregnant and vulnerable. At one point she even wonders if maybe she went too far. Drogo's men in the Khalasar are visibly angry at Dany stopping the rapes. If Drogo wasn't there, she could be killed, hurt or raped for what she does. She takes a huge risk and tries to negotiate a way to keep the women safe without having their anger directed at herself and others. Dany doesn't force anyone, it is her suggestion, a way to soften the blow, to not further endanger them or herself. This is the best she could do in the position that she was in. Again, I will never stop repeating this. This is the most she could do in that particular situation and in the position that she was in. Those few women she claimed will be her subjects in the Khalasar and won't be sold in Slaver's Bay. Drogo allows Dany to take them under her wing and says outright that the riders will not touch the women she claimed. Kevin openly states that Dany deciding to stop the rapes was a bad, rash decision. He believes and says openly that she shouldn't have done anything. Because she did not stand and announce, "No, everyone stop what you're doing, all of these women are free now," because per the author's words, she is not in the position to do so. In order to argue that Daenerys is evil for trying to stop the rapes in the Lazar, Kevin has to ignore her age and her position. He also has to deny that she was sold. That is a necessity for him to insinuate that it would be better if Dany just shrugged it off. So not only does Kevin think that Dany, a 14-year-old, is in a loving and fulfilling relationship with an evil 28-year-old slaver and that makes her evil, he made this entire argument because he wanted to insinuate that Dany stopping the rapes was something wrong. He might deny it fervently, but we know the truth.
So if we take Phoenix Ash's view on the matter, this uneducated 14-year-old bridal sex slave is now proposing that these other women, these slaves, may also become bridal sex slaves as a safe and happy alternative to their current predicament. Hold on. I need to reset myself.
At one point, she even wonders if maybe she went too far. Drogo's men in the Khalasar are visibly angry at Dany stopping the rapes. If Drogo wasn't there, she could be killed, hurt, or raped for what she does. She takes a huge risk and tries to negotiate a way to keep the women safe without having their anger directed at herself and others. Dany doesn't force anyone. It is her suggestion, a way to soften the blow, to not further endanger them or herself. This is the best she could do in the position that she was in.
And the second reason why this is a bad line of thinking, if you believe it is okay for Dany to have these women as slaves because she will not harm them or let them come to harm, then you are suggesting it is possible for there to be benevolent slave owners. Daenerys defenders often preach death to all who own slaves. The only good slaver is a dead one. So yeah, what does that say?
Let's put our brains to good use. If Dany cannot enact the idea of don't take slaves, per the author's words, can she in earnest free these women or in earnest own them? I mean, not that Kevin knows about how George perceived this situation. He skimmed through her AGOT chapters and watched the show and now considers himself to have a PhD in Dothraki studies. I have to speed up to finish this first, so I will just tell you what Kevin says next, and after that there's something of a conclusion. Kevin brings up Iroha. Does he do it to point out that Dany grieves her and feels responsible for her death, even in A Dance with Dragons, even though it was not her fault? No, he brings this up to point out that because Dany slapped her when she said that Drogo is going to die, that means she wasn't a slave. Yes, he mentions that Dany probably felt scared in that moment, but not why would she be scared. Not only because Drogo is dying, but because of what Koto says. And that would undermine the entire point he's making. Cherry picking, his favorite activity. A competition! Whoever is the first person to write in the comments what Koto says and what it means for Dany, gets a shout out in the next video.
You would think if Dany saw herself as a sex slave, she would be upset with Xaro and his sex slaves. But she said herself they looked like they were being treated kindly, so that didn't bother her.
Xaro caught it in the air and took a bite. Whence came this madness? Should I count myself fortunate that you did not free my own slaves when you were my guest in Karth? I was a beggar queen and you were Xaro of the 13, Dany thought, and all you wanted were my dragons. Your slaves seemed well treated and content. It was not till Astapor that my eyes were opened. Do you know how Unsullied are made and trained? The most insidious thing about bondage was how easy it was to grow accustomed to it. The life of most slaves was not all that different from the life of a serving man at Casterly Rock, it seemed to him. True, some slave owners and their overseers were brutal and cruel, but the same was true of some Westerosi lords and their stewards and bailiffs. Most of the Yunkai treated their chattels decently enough, so long as they did their jobs and caused no trouble, and this old man in his rusted collar, with his fierce loyalty to Lord Wobblecheeks, his owner, was not at all atypical.
You would think that she wouldn't have been so eager to go to Slaver's Bay to buy slaves.
False. It was not Daenerys who wanted to go to Slaver's Bay but Jorah. She didn't like the idea at all.
Illyrio Mopatus wants you back in Pentos, under his roof. Very well, go to him, but in your own time and not alone. Let us see how loyal and obedient these new subjects of yours truly are. Command Grolio to change course for Slaver's Bay. Dany was not certain she liked the sound of that at all. Everything she'd ever heard of the flesh marts in the great slave cities of Yunkai, Mirri, and Astapor was dire and frightening. What is there for me in Slaver's Bay? An army, said Ser Jorah. If strong Belwas is so much to your liking, you can buy hundreds more like him out of the fighting pits of Mirri, but it is Astapor I'd set my sails for. In Astapor you can buy Unsullied. The slaves in the spiked bronze hats? Dany had seen Unsullied guards in the free cities, posted at the gates of Magisters, Archons, and Dynasts. Why should I want Unsullied? They don't even ride horses, and most of them are fat.
False. She never truly wanted to buy them and was angry at Jorah for taking her to Astapor.
I have heard all I care to of their training. Dany could feel tears welling in her eyes, sudden and unwanted. Her hand flashed up and cracked Ser Jorah hard across the face. It was either that, or cry. Mormont touched the cheek she'd slapped. If I have displeased my queen dash. You have. You've displeased me greatly, Ser. If you were my true knight, you would never have brought me to this vile sty.
Due to her experience being a slave. But Daenerys was never a slave. She didn't like being treated as a commodity or a pawn by her brother, but she was not a slave. And that's what gets me when I see Dany defenders arguing hard that Dany is anti-slavery. They wield the idea that Dany is anti-slavery like an iron club. They treat it like a trump card in an argument, because the moment Dany is faced with any criticism, their go-to reply is, wow, it looks like you're pro-slavery. When criticizing Daenerys is not the same thing as being pro-slavery. Pointing out where a character is going wrong and wanting them to do better is not a bad thing. These people, they hold on to the idea that Dany is anti-slavery, and so to them, that makes Daenerys an objectively good person. They believe that she is objectively a good character, and it confuses them and in some cases enrages them when they meet people that don't agree. Because really, Dany isn't anti-slavery. Daenerys' stance on slavery has changed since the first book, but we cannot disregard that Dany once owned slaves. Because really, Dany isn't anti-slavery. Dany is against things that personally offend her. Because Drogo told her exactly what he was going to do but it wasn't until Dany saw War and that she was like, oh no, surprise Pikachu, War and are actually bad. She was personally offended because everything Dany ever heard of in the flesh marts in the great cities of Yunkai, Meereen, and Astapor was dire and frightening until Jorah convinces her to go buy slaves. You would think that she wouldn't have been so eager to go to Slaver's Bay to buy slaves until Jorah convinces her to go buy slaves. And then Dany is excited about the idea. She hops out of bed eager. She has the ship turned around immediately. She was singing sea shanties in this bitch. Until she sees personally how the slaves are treated, then she's like, oh no, surprise Pikachu, slavery is actually bad. And these are things at 14 she should already know. Especially the thing about going to Astapor, because she was warned beforehand. She knows that slavery is illegal in Westeros. She has already freed people, so why would she want to go buy more slaves? It's not until Dany is personally affected that she decides what she's against.
Notice that Daenerys is the only character in the entire series to be judged for things she could do but didn't do. For Kevin, that she had a certain intent on which she eventually changed her mind drastically is proof of her corruption and inherent evilness, and not of a potential development that changes how you should judge her character. Daenerys spent her entire life on a continent where slavery is ever-present and normalized, yet she was still able to recognize it as wrong, and the first thing she did about it was try to abolish it, immediately. During her gambit in Astapor, she had 3 baby dragons that could be killed with one swing of a sword, and yet she risked everything to start a literal slave uprising. But no, Daenerys is not anti-slavery. Her starting a fucking slave revolution does not matter because right before, she wanted to go to Astapor. I guess that if today I have a thought that I want to throw Kevin's head against the sidewall and excitedly booked a flight to US to do precisely that, but tomorrow I cancel it and decide that I won't do that, I should only be judged for the fact that I wanted to do it in the first place. No other character is treated like this. Nobody says that Jon Snow is evil and pro-slavery because he wanted to purchase slaves from Mirri and then free them. Nobody says that Westerosi characters are evil for not doing anything about feudalism because they see it as normal. But when Dany decides that what she considered normal is not actually okay, she immediately tries to do something about it. And to Kevin, that means nothing. That does not change anything. He decided that she's evil from the moment she was first raped on page, so everything that she does will be evil in his eyes.
She has an inconsistent set of values because even after Astapor, she lets people sell themselves into slavery. She doesn't realize she's enabling and profiting from the same system that saw the 163 children butchered. The same system that made Astapor a city so vile she decided to sack it. A system that runs on exploitation, so while Dany is told these people, these volunteer slaves, will be treated gently, there's no guarantee of that.
There is a scene of Dany enacting attacks on those who choose to sell themselves back to slavery, and it's used as proof that she is a slaver. This tax is in fact proposed by an ex-slave Missandei, and it's absurd to argue that an ex-slave would advise Dany to become a slaver. Have you ever heard of punitive taxes? It's a tax that is there to punish one for something, as the name suggests, and the money does not go to Dany herself but to the city, and it's used to improve the lives of the freedmen. Someone actually tried to argue with me that Missandei actually proposed this tax as an elusive test of character, because apparently Missandei needs to additionally test Dany's character after she witnessed her liberatory campaign in Astapor. She can't be sure from that alone.
It would be better to say that Dany is pro-freedom of choice. If you want to be a slave as long as it's your choice. If you want to follow me as your leader, follow me as long as it's your choice. You can fight in the fighting pits as long as it's your choice. The idea is that Dany is a leader that gives her people the freedom of choice.
And if she is a slaver or a slave owner, why is she so hated by the slaving elite and loved by the freedmen?
And it seems Daenerys believes by giving the people this freedom, they will use it to choose her. The Dothraki chose her, the Unsullied chose her, but what will happen? What will Daenerys do when the people use their freedom of choice to choose someone else to be their leader? What happens when the people don't choose her?
What about everyone else? All the other people who think they know what's good.
They don't get to choose.
They are your people, and they love you well, Magister Illyrio said amiably. In holdfasts all across the realm, men lift secret toasts to your health, while women sew dragon banners and hide them against the day of your return from across the water. He gave a massive shrug. Or so my agents tell me. Dany had no agents, no way of knowing what anyone was doing or thinking across the narrow sea, but she mistrusted Illyrio's sweet words as she mistrusted everything about Illyrio. Her brother was nodding eagerly, however. Magister Illyrio can keep you safe while your dragons grow, and send secret envoys across the narrow sea on your behalf, to sound out the High Lords for your cause. Those same High Lords who abandoned my father to the Kingslayer and bent the knee to Robert the Usurper? Even those who bent their knees may yearn in their hearts for the return of the dragons. May, said Dany. That was such a slippery word, may. In any language.
You can argue with your mother, you can even argue with your damn daddy, but you can't argue with the text. And the text tells us Daenerys Targaryen once owned slaves, and that Daenerys Targaryen has participated in the slave trade. Period. The goal isn't to argue with Phoenix Ashes. There's no benefit for me in that. And also because I can tell that Phoenix Ashes is one of those terminally online people, one of those people from the depths of Twitter and Tumblr hell, and they live for this shit, honey. Let me not even get into it.
And Kevin Pendragon is someone who, in the name of hating some fictional silver-haired girl, turned out to be a violent misogynist, rape apologist, pedophilia apologist, a liar, and someone with no functional literacy whatsoever. He is also a pathetic coward who wanted to steer some fake drama but got heart palpitations when I didn't take it lying down. Want to beat pathetic coward allegations? I'm still waiting.
I can kinda guess what's gonna happen next. Phoenix Ashes, they'll just double down that Dany was a 14-year-old, no formal education having, inbred,
Pregnant? 14-year-old bridal slave?
We know!
You know? So you agree?
Dany takes 163 leaders and doles out the punishment towards them, and spares the rest. However, we and she have no idea who is actually responsible for the heinous acts committed against the children. And it is a near guarantee that there weren't exactly 163 masters who were personally responsible for the 163 crucified children. So what that essentially means is that regardless of whether or not Daenerys over or undershot the number of people who were culpable in these acts, the alleged justice that was served in some form of retribution for the children was anything but just.
If they are leaders, then they are complicit in this act.
How many times does this have to be explained before you people get it? Daenerys merely executed 163 slave masters. She did not find out who was responsible for killing the children. That means that person or persons could still be out there, vibing in their pyramids, eating honeyed locusts and unborn puppies, straight chilling because they didn't get executed. They got away with murder. POV, you're coming home to your pyramid after watching your friends get executed for an idea you have. We don't know if justice was served because Daenerys didn't ask. I mean, I'm glad y'all are happy that a bunch of slavers got killed. I don't want them to get off scot-free for committing slavery, but I want to know if the murderers of these children were got. Is there murder? There could be a murderer. Did she? I feel like I'm losing my mind because did she get the killers or kill her, or did she not? We don't know. Because Daenerys didn't ask.
I'm pretty sure only the leaders can make such a decision. And even if they weren't, they were slavers who benefited from the system that killed these children in the first place. They owned human beings as property. And for that alone, they deserved punishment and suffering. They still profited immensely from slavery, no matter in how many pretzels you twist yourself.
Dany looked at Astapor and said, "We will do the same. Why would you copy anything from a city you hated so much that you sacked it. So now Dany rules from a pyramid in Meereen where she wears a tokar and profits from slavery.
Now you have become the very thing you swore to destroy.
There's a scene of Dany enacting a tax on those who choose to sell themselves back to slavery, and it's used as proof that she is a slaver. This tax is in fact proposed by an ex-slave Missandei, and it's absurd to argue that an ex-slave would advise Dany to become a slaver. Have you ever heard of punitive taxes? It's a tax that is there to punish one for something, as the name suggests. And the money does not go to Dany herself, but to the city, and it's used to improve the lives of the freedmen. Someone actually tried to argue with me that Missandei actually proposed this tax as an elusive test of character, because apparently Missandei needs to additionally test Dany's character after she witnessed her liberatory campaign in Astapor. She can't be sure from that alone.
It's very easy to get caught up in Dany's POV trap in many ways, but one of the biggest traps is that because she sees herself as the world's main character, the reader or viewer immediately assumes that she must be right.
You know, there actually is a character who, by the author himself, to be an unreliable narrator, and that is Sansa Stark. And I know this because I don't have to make up things George R.R. Martin said in order to further my agenda. George R.R. Martin actually says that it's Sansa who has lapses in memory. The lion's paw, lion's tooth business, on the other hand, is intentional. A small touch of the unreliable narrator. I was trying to establish that the memories of my viewpoint characters are not infallible. Sansa is simply remembering it wrong. A very minor thing. You are the only one to catch it to date. But it was meant to set the stage for a much more important lapse in memory. You will see in A Storm of Swords and later volumes that Sansa remembers the Hound kissing her that night he came to her bedroom. But if you look at that scene, he never does. That will eventually mean something, but just now it's a subtle touch, something most of the readers might not even pick up on.
If you look at the quoted passage, you will see it says, "My viewpoint characters are not infallible," plural. Martin is saying all of his characters can be unreliable narrators. And if you were really paying attention, you would have noticed there's a mistake here. It was not Sansa that misremembered the name of Joffrey's sword, it was Arya. But Phoenix Ashes blunders through the whole thing, attributing all this to Sansa, not acknowledging the mistake because it's convenient for the sake of their anti-Sansa stance. Viewpoint characters. Sansa isn't the only one. Phoenix Ashes, you just read it. What are you doing?
But there is a big problem with something called functional illiteracy.
Clearly, Phoenix Ashes doesn't subscribe to the Lemongate theory, and neither do I, large portions of it. But Martin has hinted there is something about Dany's memories of her past. So again, it's not just Sansa who has problems recalling things correctly. I don't fault Phoenix for not knowing every single not a blog post or George R.R. Martin interview, but it said it right in the passage they quote. Martin said it. He said, "My viewpoint characters are not infallible." How did they miss that?
Functional illiteracy. The very first seconds of his video already told me what I can expect of it. It's going to be nitpicking words and expressions in order to make me seem unreliable or lying. Yes, Martin says all of his POVs are unreliable, but he specifically singles out Sansa, so yes, he calls her unreliable. And that it was Arya who misremembered the name of the sword is irrelevant, it's George's mistake and not mine. I mentioned Sansa because it's Dany who is most often called an unreliable narrator, probably more so than any other character in A Song of Ice and Fire. Still, George very explicitly highlights Sansa out as an unreliable narrator among his other viewpoints, and not Dany, as some people like to believe. This passage itself is what gave prominence to the unreliable narrator talking point, and even though it's Sansa who's mentioned here, this argument is always used against Dany.
This reminded me of a Tumblr poll, not too long ago, where someone compiled a few POV characters and asked who among them was the most reliable narrator. I'm not sure if I can put links in comment sections, but it's the first result if you Google the most reliable narrator in a Soy of Tumblr poll. Sansa was on the upper hand of the results, despite the unkissed memory and all of the softening of reality Sansa does in order to shield herself from the abuse, or the truth, in front of her eyes. I do believe it's a result of how the fandom is so bent to the idea that Sansa is the central figure of most/all of GRRM's themes, so anything that she perceives must be right. If she makes any mistakes or even repeats them, then it's because she's just a little girl and she will learn better, even if other, younger characters do not make or repeat said mistake.
The issue of the house with the red door and the fact that lemon trees do not grow in Bravos was brought up to George's attention several times. Dany remembers a lemon tree outside the house with the red door in Bravos, but citrus trees shouldn't really grow in Bravos' cold, foggy climate. Is this discrepancy significant? Does it point to future revelations about Dany's past? Very perceptive of you. Yes, it does point to... well, that would be telling. How old was Daenerys when she left the house with the red door? Was it located close to the palace of the Sea Lord of Bravos? That's an interesting question, but I don't think I'm going to answer it. There's a certain revelation about the red door that will come into the books that I have yet to write, so we'll keep an eye on it. For example, when asked how old was Daenerys when she left the house with the red door, he said keep reading, and added that the door is not just a memory of Daenerys' happy childhood. There will be a lot more about these doors in the Winds of Winter.
It is mostly an emotional reaction that drives her to kill them, and it is mostly an emotional reaction that makes her regret killing them as well. Dany's emotional inner life is what makes her an appealing and relatable character, but it is also what exposes her as a very poor ruler.
So now you take a 15-year-old who had no formal education.
15-year-olds with no formal education should not be in positions of absolute power.
And yet, as far as I'm concerned, she's doing a better job than other worthless characters in this worthless story. Even her antis and Reddit incels admit that she's basically a military prodigy. And with her one gambit, half of Essos sees her as a messianic figure. Dany is also far from the only teenager in the position of absolute power, so again, Kevin unfairly singles her out. And was basically thrown into a leadership position.
Daenerys was not thrown into a leadership position. She chose to be queen all the way back in Book 1 on the Dothraki Sea.
So because Dany decides to take that leadership position herself, which she sees as her duty anyway, as I later show, that means she shouldn't have that position? And I admit that? One does not follow from the other unless you believe in that "I don't want it" bullshit from the show. And considering that Kevin fucking loves D&D and loves to use points from the show to argue the books, that makes sense. And write my fucking name in uppercase. Dany thinks that she is merely doing her duty as a queen. Soon Dany was as clean as she was ever going to be. She pushed herself to her feet, splashing softly. Water ran down her legs and bedded on her breasts. The sun was climbing up the sky and her people would soon be gathering. She would rather have drifted in the fragrant pool all day, eating iced fruit of silver trays and dreaming of a house with a red door, but the queen belongs to her people, not to herself. I was alone for a long time, Jorah. All alone but for my brother. I was such a small, scared thing. Viserys should have protected me, but instead he hurt me and scared me worse. He shouldn't have done that. He wasn't just my brother, he was my king. Why do the gods make kings and queens, if not to protect the ones who can't protect themselves? Some kings make themselves. Robert did. He was no true king. Dany said scornfully. He did no justice. Justice. That's what kings are for.
If I were not the blood of the dragon, she thought wistfully, this could be my home. She was Khaleesi, she had a strong man and a swift horse, handmaids to serve her, warriors to keep her safe, an honored place in the Dosh Khaleen awaiting her when she grew old, and in her womb grew a son who would one day bestride the world. That should be enough for any woman, but not for the dragon. With Viserys gone, Daenerys was the last, the very last. She was the seed of kings and conquerors, and so too the child inside her. She must not forget, the most insidious thing about bondage was how easy it was to grow accustomed to it. The life of most slaves was not all that different from the life of a serving man at Casterly Rock, it seemed to him. True, some slave owners and their overseers were brutal and cruel, but the same was true of some Westerosi lords and their stewards and bailiffs. Most of the Yunkai treated their chattels decently enough, so long as they did their jobs and caused no trouble, and this old man in his rusted collar, with his fierce loyalty to Lord Wobblecheeks, his owner, was not at all atypical.
She sacked Astapor, she made Yunkai cave to her demands, and she sacked and claimed Meereen. She chose to remain as Queen of Meereen. This was her choice.
But how can I rule 7 kingdoms if I cannot rule a single city? He had no answer to that. Dany turned away from them, to gaze out over the city once again. My children need time to heal and learn. My dragons need time to grow and test their wings. And I need the same. I will not let this city go the way of Astapor. I will not let the harpy of Yunkai chain up those I've freed all over again. She turned back to look at their faces. I will not march. What will you do then, Khaleesi? Asked Rakaro. Stay, she said. Rule. And be a queen. I gave you good counsel. Save your spears and swords for the 7 kingdoms, I told you. Leave Mirri to the Mirrinese and go west, I said. You would not listen. I had to take Mirri or see my children starve along the march. Dany could still see the trail of corpses she had left behind her crossing the Red Waste. It was not a sight she wished to see again. I had to take Mirri to feed my people.
The only position of power she was thrown into is that of Khaleesi, but according to Phoenix Ashes, Khaleesi's have no power. According to them, a Khaleesi is not a leadership position. So, which is it?
Kathy.
Makishan Mayaha. Kifi Kash Shatlaya Farmai.
Assembly Cersei.
These people will say anything to make Dany out to be the poor, helpless victim.
Dany is an exile, powerless, at the mercy of other people. At the mercy of other people.
Sansa was a child bride who was horribly abused on the orders of Joffrey, the bastard king. Joffrey threatened to and impregnate her even after her marriage to Tyrion. Sansa is currently being groomed by a man old enough to be her father. You could even argue he is molesting her. Yet Phoenix Ashes spends the entire video throwing shade at Sansa. This proves that, for all their protestations, Phoenix Ashes doesn't actually care about child brides who are victims of predators and abuse. All Phoenix Ashes cares about is defending Daenerys Targaryen, which reveals their greatest sin. And that is, they are full of shit.
The very last thing I will address in this video is that I was not the one who started. Daenerys fans were not the ones who started arbitrarily hating Sansa. Sansa was hated by incels and other misogynists at first, not by Dany fans. However, around season 6, when Jon's delusion sprouted, it was Sansa fans who started to baselessly attack Daenerys. They are the ones who began calling her a colonizer, slaver, slave owner, imperialist and white supremacist. They are the ones who were the authors of the disgusting political Jon theory. They were the ones who literally creamed themselves to Jon committing femicide. They are the sources of like 99% of the arguments that you use. And Here's Alive is one of those people. Here's Alive is one of those Sansa fans who arbitrarily started to hate Dany even before these two met in the show. This is why I make jabs at Sansa. This is in retaliation for how differently she is treated.
Sansa was a child bride who was horribly abused on the orders of Joffrey, the bastard king. And the best defense for this I can hear coming is that Daenerys is a child. She's 14. Leave her alone. And if that's your best defense, you can pack your things and go. There's the moon door. Because this child queen is in a position of great power and influence. Joffrey threatened to and impregnate her even after her marriage to Tyrion. Now, does that mean I don't think Drogo has never forced himself on Daenerys because she was Khaleesi and the Khaleesi can't be harmed in that way? No. Only an actual idiot would think I'm suggesting that. Sansa is currently being groomed by a man old enough to be her father. You could even argue he is molesting her. This could indicate Dany is falling in love with Drogo and vice versa. Phoenix Ashes, however, insist throughout their video what Dany suffers from is not love, but Stockholm Syndrome. If you look at Dany and Drogo's relationship late in book 1, and you can't believe she's calling him sweet nicknames and admiring his body and his long braided hair, you can't possibly believe she loves him and would literally die for him. You think this behavior is so abnormal, she must be suffering from some sort of mental trauma, because that's the only excuse for her actions. Dany would never love a slaver or a... So you write off her behavior as some sort of trauma response. Let me suggest to you, then maybe you don't actually like Daenerys Targaryen.
And you showed this in your video. You literally said that Dany is a powerful Khaleesi, but that Sansa is a powerless child bride. Literally, fuck you! Pierdol się, ty jebany pajacu bez... You know what? I'm genuinely disappointed. I feel like I wasted my time. I hoped to be genuinely challenged, but I wasn't. I hoped that we would at least get some entertaining drama out of it. You know, some good throwing shit at one another. But Kevin immediately bailed out. Because he's a pathetic coward, as already established. Aside from being a pathetic coward, he's just stupid. Like unimaginably dumb. And uses the same arguments I've already seen and debunked before. Which is good for me, all I had to do is show a clip for my previous videos. The worst thing about it is that he will not see it. He will not realize how big of a fool he made out of himself, and his sheep audience will bleed praises for his PowerPoint presentation with cringe reaction videos sprinkled here and there, when he has nothing of substance or value and repeats arguments other people already used. The first person who came up with them should start charging royalties. I wanted to do a long and detailed summary of this entire situation, but I just want to finish this video and forget this guy ever existed. So, make your own conclusions.